welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I would like to recommend some books to you if maybe you're new to Victorian literature. As you may know, the month of October is one of my favorite reading months because here on YouTube there's a reading event that takes place the entire month of October called Victober, and the whole purpose of it is to celebrate Victorian literature. If you're not new to my channel, you probably know how much I love Victorian literature and that I was basically born and raised on it. But I recognize that Victorian literature can be really intimidating and scary to people who might be interested in trying it but feel like the language is a barrier or the length of some of the books is a barrier. So I want to provide you with a list of books that are a really good place to start, that are easier to read or maybe shorter. I also did a list last year of 10 Victorian classics that were under 300 pages, so I'll link that video as well so you can check that out. But those were definitely not recommended necessarily based on ease of language or easiness to get into the plot or anything like that, but they are shorter, so they can be less intimidating as well. Some of the recommendations that I have on this list are on the shorter side, so that helps as well. Some of them are longer, but I felt like they flew by and were really easy to get into. So a really good entry place for Victorian literature can be Victorian middle grade, because they're really fun stories and oftentimes the language can be a bit easier than some of the others. So I have a couple of those to recommend to you. Starting off with Oscar Wilde's fairy tale stories. I read this collection a couple of years ago during Victober and it was delightful. This particular edition has 9 fairy tales in it. Some of them are longer than others. Some of them I liked more than others. But I think that this is a wonderful place to start. Oscar Wilde's fairy tales have some of the same darkness in them that Grimm's fairy tales do, and they definitely have like morals and stories that he is trying to tell through them. But I thought that they were just absolutely delightful to read. Next up is an author that you will have heard of if you are a fan of C.S. Lewis, and that's George MacDonald. So George MacDonald was actually one of C.S. Lewis's most favorite authors, and one of my favorite books by George MacDonald is The Princess and the Goblin. This is a fairy tale story that is really, really beautiful about a young princess and this boy named Curdy, and they're trying to help their kingdom because they find out that there are these goblins that are living underneath the kingdom and are wanting to try to take over. And so it follows them as well as Irene's grandmother who is guiding them, and it just has a lot of beautiful, deep spiritual truth to it, in addition to it being just a really good story. And the last middle grade I'm going to recommend to you is probably one that you're familiar with, as there have been popular movie adaptations made of it, and that is Black Beauty. Black Beauty, I would say, is a good book for animal lovers, but it's also a hard book for animal lovers because there's a lot of abuse that happens to animals here, which was the point that the author was trying to make, was to try to highlight the way that animals were mistreated during the Victorian time period. But it follows a black horse called Black Beauty and the different owners that he has throughout the book, some of which are really wonderful owners to take really good care of him, and some of which are not. But I still think that this is just a marvelous book and I love it to pieces. I feel like no Victorian literature list is complete without a Charles Dickens on it, as he is probably the most well-known Victorian author. I have made a video about why you should read Dickens and some things to expect when you're reading Dickens, as well as some good starting places for Dickens. So I will link that video in case Dickens scares you, because he has a reputation of being very wordy, and he is, but I think that some of his books are more accessible than others as a starting point. I have more recommendations in the video that I've already mentioned, but the book I'm going to recommend to you today is Great Expectations. This is actually one of my favorite Dickens, and I think that it is more accessible because a lot of Dickens novels have like a very wide, sweeping cast of characters, and as a result, it's kind of hard to get your bearings sometimes, in addition to struggling with getting accustomed to Victorian language and things like that. This book is told in first person, and it's about a young boy named Pip who is an orphan being raised by his sister and her husband, and he has a turnabout in his fortunes throughout this book. And it's very interesting, the different elements to this book, because there's definitely like moments of suspense and moments of surprise, and I absolutely love this book. I've also done a dedicated review for this as well. It's one of my favorite Dickens of all time, but I do think that it's pretty accessible because it's told in first person, so we're being introduced to characters a bit more gradually than we are in some of Dickens' other works, such as Bleak House or Our Mutual Friend or books like that. The next book that I'm going to recommend is a book that you will find on probably every must-read Victorian literature list, and also on a lot of lists for beginners, because though this book is giant, it reads really quickly and the language is fairly accessible, and that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I love the Bronte sisters. There's 3 of them, and they all have very distinct writing styles and things that they focus on in their writing. But Jane Eyre is a classic of classics for a reason. This is a really compelling story about a young girl who is an orphan who becomes a governess, and it follows her hardships throughout her life, but there's also some mystery, some intrigue, some romance. So I feel like there's a little bit of something for everyone in here, as well as just some very, very quotable and beautiful phrases that once you see them in this book, you'll be like, oh, that's where that came from. The next book I'm going to recommend to you is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a book that I've actually heard compared to Pride and Prejudice, and I don't think that that's a fair comparison because this book is a lot more serious than Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is very humorous, very satirical, and this book is definitely not. This book follows a young girl whose family falls on hard times, and as a result, they are forced to move to the north of England, which is very industrialized. So where she lived before has beautiful countryside, and now she's moved to somewhere where the culture is very different. And so this book really examines the working conditions of the industrialization of England and factory workers. And then it also does have a romance between people who misunderstand each other in a very similar way that Darcy and Elizabeth misunderstand each other in Pride and Prejudice. And I think that that's why there's a comparison there, but honestly, they're really not similar in tone or in writing style. But this book is fabulous and also has a really great miniseries that I've heard so many people tell me that they absolutely loved the miniseries. I've not watched it, but I'm sure it's great. If you're looking for something short to dip your toes into, might I point you in the direction of Sherlock Holmes. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories. A lot of the ones that are in here are just a couple of pages long, but he also wrote some longer ones such as The Hound of the Baskervilles and also A Study in Scarlet. So he's got some that are more like a couple of 100 pages long, and so they're still relatively short, but a lot of the ones in here are incredibly brief. They are just really, really fun, and obviously this really popularized the detective story, although Doyle was not the first one to write a detective story like this, but Sherlock Holmes has like stood the test of time as to being really good detective stories. If you're looking for something a bit more action or adventure heavy, I'd like to point you in the direction of The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. I actually read this book last year and didn't realize it was written in the Victorian time period because it reads so much more modern. In this book, we follow a man who kind of ends up sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time in a neighboring country to where he lives, and there's a case of mistaken identity that happens, and he gets kind of embroiled in this plot that's happening in this country. And so it's definitely got some like swashbuckling adventure, some romance. It's got like a little bit of everything. The next book that I'm going to recommend to you is quite chunky, but don't let that deter you. Like, it's one of the bigger books that I am recommending here, and that is The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Some people might suggest that you start with The Moonstone, which is a much shorter book by Wilkie Collins. That's a detective story, but I found this story much more interesting than The Moonstone. The Moonstone involves a plot of like a stolen jewel that's gone missing, and I find this story to be a lot more intriguing. So this story begins with a young man who is an artist on his way somewhere, and he encounters this ghostly, eerie looking woman in white, and then she disappears. He then ends up going to become an art teacher to 2 young ladies, and finds out more about this mysterious woman in white, and the plot just keeps unraveling as we go. It's also laid out really interesting in that we have some like witness testimonies from different characters, as well as like somebody's journal and different letters and things like that. So it feels like a compilation of things as we're trying to work through this story and figure out exactly what is going on here. We're getting different perspectives, and it is just fascinating. I first read this book probably like 12 years ago, and I got it on my Kindle having never heard of Wilkie Collins before, and I flew through this book because I absolutely just like had to know what in the world was going on. And there's a twist that happens probably about halfway through the book, and I gasped so loud that my husband came from the other room and was like, what happened? The last book that I want to recommend to you is by an author that I would say is maybe a more intimidating Victorian author, and that's George Eliot. George Eliot is known most especially, I think, for Middlemarch, and I do not think that Middlemarch is the best place to start with her, because it's a lot. But I want to recommend this one because this is a book that my dad read to me out loud when I was, I think, 10 or 11, and it was my introduction to Victorian literature. And that is none other than Silus Marner. Silus Marner, I think, is the shortest of Eliot's works, although I think she has some short stories as well. But this is the shortest like complete novel of hers. And as such, I think that it does have some shortcomings that some of her longer books don't have, in that we have less time for her to develop her characters. And so there are criticisms you could make about this book, but I think it's a really great introduction into her writing style to find out like how she writes, be able to dip your toes into that, because she has the most beautiful prose. And of course, I have a very heavy nostalgic attachment to this book as well. I've probably read it 4 or 5 times throughout my life, but this is a story of a man who is an old miser who kind of keeps to himself, and kind of his journey as he learns to love and learns to think and feel outside himself. And it's really beautiful, and I really love it. Well, there you have it. There are 10 Victorian classics that maybe might be a good place to start for you if you don't know where to start with Victorian literature, or you feel kind of intimidated. These are books that I feel like the language is easier, or the books are shorter, or they read really quickly. So I hope that this is a really good starting point for you. And maybe if you are familiar with Victorian literature, maybe there are some gems on here that you've not yet read before. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. Where do you think are some good starting places for Victorian literature? We can make the comment section kind of like a compilation of more suggestions of good places to start. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.